In this immersive audiobook documentary, we journey through the epic story of the Dutch Delta Works, an engineering marvel born from tragedy and transformed into a global symbol of resilience. From the devastating North Sea flood of 1953 to the visionary Delta Plan and the construction of colossal barriers like the Oosterschelde-Kering and Maesland-Kering, this 20-chapter narrative reveals how the Netherlands reshaped its landscape to defend against the sea. Blending historical depth with technical insight, cultural memory, and ecological reflection, this video offers a powerful account of how a nation turned vulnerability into strength and how its legacy continues to guide the world in an age of rising seas. Chapter 1: The Low Countries and the Sea. For as long as human memory reaches, the land now known as the Netherlands has existed in a delicate balance between earth and water. The Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt rivers, carrying the meltwaters of the Alps and the rains of Western Europe, fan out into a vast delta before meeting the restless North Sea. This delta is a place of extraordinary fertility, its alluvial soils rich and dark, but it is also a place of constant peril. The tides push inland twice a day, storm surges can rise without warning, and the rivers themselves swell with seasonal floods. The very geography that made the Low Countries a cradle of agriculture and trade also made them vulnerable to the sea's encroachment. In many places, the land lies below mean sea level, a fact that has shaped not only the physical landscape, but the national psyche. The earliest settlers, arriving in prehistoric times, adapted to this amphibious environment by building their homes on artificial mounds known as terpen or vierden. These raised earthworks offered refuge from the highest tides, but they were isolated havens, not a comprehensive solution. Over centuries, as communities grew and agriculture expanded, the need to protect larger tracts of land became urgent. The first primitive dikes were little more than earthen embankments, often breached by the sea's relentless force. Yet these early defenses marked the beginning of a long tradition of human intervention in the Dutch landscape, a tradition that would evolve into one of the most sophisticated water management systems in the world. By the Middle Ages, the inhabitants of the Low Countries had begun to organize collectively to maintain and improve their defenses. This led to the formation of water boards, or waterschappen, some of the oldest democratic institutions in Europe. These bodies were responsible for the upkeep of dikes, sluices, and drainage canals, and their authority often transcended local feudal boundaries. The cooperation required to keep the sea at bay fostered a culture of consensus and shared responsibility. It also meant that water management was not merely a technical matter, but a deeply ingrained social and political priority. The survival of entire communities depended on the diligence of these institutions. The economic prosperity of the Dutch Golden Age in the 17th century was built in part on this mastery over water. Windmills, initially used for grinding grain, were adapted to pump water from low-lying polders into higher canals, allowing reclaimed land to be farmed and inhabited. The intricate network of dikes, sluices, and pumping stations expanded, transforming marshes and tidal flats into productive farmland. Yet even in this era of engineering triumph, the sea remained a constant threat. Storm surges could undo decades of labor in a single night, and the memory of past disasters lingered in the collective consciousness. The Dutch learned to live with a paradox. Their prosperity depended on the very element that could destroy it. This intimate relationship with water shaped not only the economy and infrastructure, but also the culture and identity of the Netherlands. Folk tales, paintings, and literature often depicted the sea as both a giver and taker of life. The flat horizons, intersected by canals and dotted with windmills, became symbols of a nation's resilience. Yet, beneath the surface of this pastoral image lay a constant vigilance. Every generation inherited the responsibility to maintain and improve the defenses, knowing that complacency could be fatal. This enduring struggle between land and sea set the stage for the monumental challenges and achievements that would follow in the centuries to come, culminating in the creation of the Delta Works, a project that would redefine the relationship between the Dutch people and the waters that surrounded them. Chapter 2: Historic Flood Disasters. The history of the Low Countries is punctuated by catastrophic floods that reshaped both the land and the lives of its inhabitants. Among the most devastating was the St. Elizabeth flood of 1421, which struck during the night of November 18th, 19. A fierce storm surge from the North Sea, driven by hurricane-force winds, coincided with swollen rivers, overwhelming the dikes of the Groot Ward region in the county of Holland. Entire villages were swept away, and an estimated 2,000 people perished. The floodwaters permanently altered the geography, creating the Biesbosch wetlands from what had once been fertile farmland. The disaster became etched into Dutch collective memory, not only for its human toll, but for the enduring reminder that the sea could reclaim land in a single night, undoing generations of labor. The St. Felix flood of 1530, often referred to as the Evil Saturday flood, was another calamity that underscored the fragility of the coastal defenses. On November 5th of that year, a violent storm surge breached the dikes of Zeeland and Flanders, submerging vast areas and drowning entire towns. The most infamous loss was the city of Reimerswal, once a thriving port, which was gradually abandoned as repeated inundations made rebuilding impossible. The flood claimed thousands of lives and transformed productive polders into the verdronken landen, the drowned lands, a haunting term that still appears on maps today. These drowned landscapes became both a warning and a symbol, a visible testament to the consequences of underestimating the sea's power. The All Saints' flood of 1570 was perhaps the most widespread disaster of the 16th century, affecting nearly the entire Dutch coastline. On November 1st, a massive storm surge overwhelmed defenses from Friesland to Zeeland, killing an estimated 20,000 people. The floodwaters penetrated deep inland, contaminating freshwater supplies and destroying crops, leading to famine in the months that followed. This disaster occurred during the turbulent years of the 80 Years' War, compounding the suffering of a population already burdened by political and religious conflict. The scale of the tragedy reinforced the necessity of coordinated water management. Yet, the political fragmentation of the time often hindered the implementation of large-scale protective measures. Even in the more technologically advanced 18th and 19th centuries, the Netherlands remained vulnerable. The Christmas flood of 1717 struck the northern provinces of Groningen, Friesland, and Drenthe, as well as parts of Germany, killing over 14,000 people. It was the last great flood to devastate the northern coast, but it served as a grim reminder that improved dike construction alone could not guarantee safety. In the 19th century, floods in 1809, 1825, and 1855 inundated large areas, with the 1825 event in particular causing widespread destruction in Friesland and Overijssel. These disasters revealed that while engineering had advanced, the forces of nature could still overwhelm human defenses, especially when maintenance was neglected or when political will faltered. By the early 20th century, the Netherlands had experienced centuries of recurring floods, each leaving its mark on the landscape and the national consciousness. The Zuiderzee flood of 1916, which inundated large parts of North Holland and Waterland, became a catalyst for the eventual closure of the Zuiderzee with the Afsluitdijk in 1932. Yet even with such monumental projects, the memory of past disasters lingered. The cumulative history of these floods created a cultural awareness that safety from the sea was never absolute. This legacy of loss and resilience would set the stage for the events of 1953, when the North Sea once again rose against the Dutch coast, triggering the most ambitious water defense project in the nation's history, the Delta Works. Chapter 3: Early Water Management Innovations. By the dawn of the Middle Ages, the inhabitants of the Low Countries had begun to move beyond mere survival in the face of the sea's power, developing deliberate strategies to shape and control their environment. The earliest dikes were rudimentary earthen embankments, often built by local farmers to protect their fields from tidal incursions. These structures were low and narrow, vulnerable to erosion and overtopping, but they represented a crucial shift in mindset, the recognition that collective human effort could hold back the water, at least temporarily. Over time, these embankments were raised, widened, and reinforced with clay, fascines, and sod, creating more durable barriers. The construction of ring dikes around entire polders allowed communities to reclaim land from tidal flats and marshes, transforming them into productive farmland. This process was labor-intensive and required constant maintenance, but it laid the foundation for the Netherlands' reputation as a nation built by human hands. The organization of water management became increasingly formalized during the 12th and 13th centuries. As settlements expanded and the scale of reclamation projects grew, it became clear that no single landowner could maintain defenses alone. This necessity gave rise to the Waterschappen, or water boards, autonomous regional bodies tasked with the upkeep of dikes, sluices, and drainage systems. These institutions were remarkable for their democratic character in a feudal age. Landowners, tenants, and sometimes even townspeople had a voice in decision-making, proportional to the land they held and the taxes they paid. The water boards established rules for inspection, repair schedules, and penalties for negligence, ensuring that the collective interest in safety was upheld. Their authority often transcended local political boundaries, creating a network of cooperation that would endure for centuries. Technological innovation accompanied these institutional developments. The introduction of the windmill as a water management tool in the late Middle Ages revolutionized polder drainage. Initially used for grinding grain, windmills were adapted to drive scoop wheels, and later Archimedean screws, lifting water from low-lying fields into higher canals and rivers. This allowed for the reclamation of land that lay well below high tide levels, expanding the agricultural base and supporting population growth. The Dutch landscape began to take on its distinctive appearance, a patchwork of rectangular fields intersected by straight canals, with windmills standing sentinel along the horizon. These machines were not merely symbols of rural charm. They were vital components of a sophisticated hydraulic system that kept the land habitable. The expansion of navigable waterways was another critical aspect of early water management. Canals served a dual purpose. They drained excess water from the land and provided transport routes for goods and people. In some cases, natural rivers were straightened or diverted to improve flow and reduce the risk of flooding. Sluices, equipped with wooden gates, allowed water to be released into the sea at low tide, while preventing its return at high tide. These structures required careful design and constant attention, as a single failure could lead to catastrophic inundation. The integration of drainage, transport, and flood defense into a single system reflected the Dutch ability to think holistically about their environment, balancing economic needs with safety. By the early modern period, the Netherlands had become a laboratory for hydraulic engineering, attracting attention from across Europe. Foreign visitors marveled at the scale and precision of the dike systems, the ingenuity of the windmills, and the efficiency of the water boards. Yet this success was never taken for granted. The sea remained an unpredictable adversary, and the rivers could swell without warning. Every innovation was tested by storms and floods, and each failure prompted further refinement. This culture of continuous improvement, born of necessity, would prove essential in the centuries to come, when the challenges of water management would grow ever more complex, and the stakes would rise to unprecedented heights. Chapter 4: Warnings Ignored. In the decades leading up to the disaster of 1953, the Netherlands had already been given ample warning that its coastal defenses were inadequate for the challenges of the modern age. Reports from engineers and hydrologists in the early 20th century repeatedly highlighted the vulnerability of the southwestern provinces, particularly Zeeland, South Holland, and parts of North Brabant. The Zuiderzee Works, completed in 1932 with the construction of the Afsluit Dike, had demonstrated the nation's capacity for monumental hydraulic engineering, but it also created a false sense of security. Many assumed that the lessons learned from the Zuiderzee flood of 1916 had been fully applied to the rest of the country. In reality, the dikes along the estuaries of the Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt remained largely as they had been for decades, low, narrow, and in some cases built on unstable foundations of peat and sand. The interwar years saw several smaller flood events that should have served as catalysts for action. In 1928, a storm surge in Zealand overtopped dikes in multiple locations, causing localized inundations. In 1944 and 1945, during the final stages of the Second World War, deliberate flooding by retreating German forces and Allied military operations devastated parts of Zealand and South Holland. These wartime inundations exposed weaknesses in the dike systems and drainage infrastructure, yet post-war reconstruction priorities focused on housing, industry, and transport rather than comprehensive coastal defense. The Netherlands was rebuilding from the ruins of occupation, and resources were scarce. Water management authorities often had to make do with patchwork repairs rather than full-scale modernization. By the late 1940s, a small but persistent group of engineers, led by figures such as Johann van Veen of Rijkswaterstaat, began issuing increasingly urgent warnings. Van Veen, a brilliant but sometimes abrasive hydrologist, had conducted detailed studies of storm surge patterns in the North Sea and concluded that the southwestern delta was dangerously exposed. His calculations showed that a combination of high spring tide, low atmospheric pressure, and a northwesterly gale could produce water levels well above the design height of existing dikes. He argued for a bold plan to shorten the coastline by closing off several estuaries, thereby reducing the length of dikes that needed to be maintained. However, his proposals were met with skepticism and political hesitation. The scale of the works he envisioned was unprecedented, and many feared the economic and ecological consequences of sealing off tidal waters. Economic constraints played a decisive role in delaying action. The Netherlands in the early 1950s was still dependent on Marshall Plan aid and was directing much of its budget toward industrial modernization and housing for a rapidly growing population. Coastal defense, while acknowledged as important, was often relegated to a secondary priority. Local water boards responsible for maintaining many of the dikes operated on limited budgets and were reluctant to raise taxes to finance major upgrades. In some cases, the political structure itself hindered decisive action. The fragmented authority over water management meant that national, provincial, and local bodies had to agree on plans, a process that could take years. The result was a patchwork of defenses, some well maintained, others dangerously neglected. Nature itself offered repeated reminders of the risks. Storm surges in 1949 and 1952 came perilously close to overtopping dikes in Zealand and South Holland. In both cases, emergency sandbagging and favorable shifts in wind direction prevented disaster, but these near misses were not enough to spur the sweeping reforms that experts like Van Veen demanded. The warnings were there, in technical reports, in the memories of wartime flooding, and in the lived experience of those who tended the dikes. But they were drowned out by competing priorities and a belief that the worst could be avoided. When the great storm of January 31st, 1953 finally struck, it did so against a backdrop of decades of underinvestment, political hesitation, and ignored expertise, ensuring that the consequences would be as devastating as they were inevitable. Chapter 5: The Night of January. 31st February 1953. The final hours of January 1953 began with an ominous shift in the weather over the North Sea. A deep Atlantic depression moving eastward intensified as it approached the British Isles, bringing with it a powerful northwesterly gale. The low atmospheric pressure caused the sea level to rise, while the wind drove water toward the narrow funnel of the southern North Sea. On the evening of January 31st, the tide was already unusually high due to the spring phase of the moon. As the storm deepened, the wind speed increased to over 100 kilometers per hour, pushing a massive surge of water toward the Dutch coast. In the southwestern provinces, the dikes, many of them old, narrow, and built on unstable peat, were already saturated from weeks of heavy rain. The stage was set for disaster, though few yet realized the scale of what was coming. As midnight approached, the combination of high tide, storm surge, and wind-driven waves began to overwhelm the defenses. In Zeeland, South Holland, and parts of North Brabant, water levels rose to heights never before recorded. The first breaches occurred in the province of Zeeland, where the sea poured through weakened sections of dike, flooding low-lying polders with terrifying speed. In many villages, the alarm came too late. Telephone lines were cut by the storm, and in some areas, the only warning was the sound of the wind and the sudden roar of water. Families were forced to flee in darkness, wading or swimming through icy floodwaters, often with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The cold was merciless. The water temperature hovered just above freezing, and hypothermia claimed many lives before rescue could arrive. By the early hours of February 1st, the disaster had spread across a vast swath of the southwestern Netherlands. Entire sections of dike collapsed under the relentless pressure, creating breaches hundreds of meters wide. The sea surged inland, submerging farms, roads, and entire villages. In some places, the water rose so quickly that residents were trapped in their homes, forced to climb into attics or onto rooftops. Livestock drowned in their stalls, and machinery, furniture, and debris floated through the streets. The darkness and the howling wind made rescue efforts nearly impossible. Local volunteers, police, and soldiers worked frantically to save those they could, but the scale of the flooding was overwhelming. In many cases, survivors were left clinging to trees, rooftops, or improvised rafts for hours, waiting for daylight and the hope of rescue. When morning came, the full extent of the catastrophe began to emerge. The floodwaters covered more than 1,500 square kilometers, and in some areas the depth exceeded 4 meters. The death toll would eventually reach 1,136 people, with tens of thousands more displaced from their homes. Over 47,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed, and more than 200,000 livestock perished. The economic losses were staggering, but the human suffering was incalculable. Many survivors had lost not only their homes and possessions, but also family members, friends, and neighbors. The psychological shock was profound, especially in communities where entire streets or villages had been wiped from the map. The disaster was the worst to strike the Netherlands in the 20th century, and it left a scar that would endure for generations. The night of January 31st, February 1st, 1953, was more than a natural disaster. It was a turning point in Dutch history. It exposed the vulnerability of a nation that had long prided itself on its mastery over water. The storm's surge had revealed the inadequacy of existing defenses and the dangers of complacency in the face of nature's power. In the days and weeks that followed, the Netherlands would mobilize on a scale not seen since the war, launching rescue and recovery operations and beginning the long process of rebuilding. But even as the immediate crisis unfolded, voices were already calling for a radical rethinking of the country's relationship with the sea, a vision that would eventually take shape as the Delta Plan, the most ambitious water defense project the world had ever seen. Chapter 6: National Shock and International Aid. The morning after the storm of January 31st, February 1st, 1953, revealed a nation in shock. Across Zeeland, South Holland, and North Brabant, the floodwaters still covered vast areas, and the scale of the destruction was only beginning to be understood. Roads were impassable, rail lines severed, and entire communities cut off from the outside world. Survivors, many of them cold, hungry, and injured, waited on rooftops, in attics, or on makeshift rafts for rescue. The Dutch government, led by Prime Minister Willem Dries, quickly declared a national emergency, mobilizing the armed forces, police, and civil defense units. Yet the logistical challenges were immense. With so many breaches in the dikes and so much infrastructure destroyed, reaching the most isolated victims required boats, amphibious vehicles, and in some cases, aircraft. The disaster was not confined to the Netherlands alone. Parts of England, Belgium, and even France had also been struck by the same storm surge, but the Netherlands bore the heaviest human toll. The shock was not only physical, but deeply emotional. The Netherlands had endured the trauma of the Second World War less than a decade earlier, and now, in peacetime, it faced a catastrophe of similar magnitude in terms of human suffering. Radio broadcasts carried urgent appeals for help, and newspapers printed harrowing photographs of flooded villages and exhausted rescuers. The Queen, Juliana, traveled to the affected areas within days, meeting survivors and offering words of comfort. Her presence was a powerful symbol of national unity, and her public statements emphasized the need for solidarity and swift action. The royal family's involvement helped galvanize public support for relief efforts, and donations began to pour in from across the country. International aid arrived with remarkable speed. The United States, still engaged in post-war reconstruction efforts in Europe through the Marshall Plan, sent supplies, equipment, and technical assistance. The United Kingdom dispatched Royal Air Force planes to drop food, blankets, and medical supplies to stranded communities. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, with their strong historical ties to the Netherlands, organized fundraising campaigns and sent shipments of clothing, medicines, and building materials. Neighboring Belgium provided military units and engineering teams to assist with rescue and repair operations. Even countries far removed from the North Sea, such as Switzerland and Sweden, contributed funds and relief goods. The disaster became a moment of international humanitarian cooperation, with the Netherlands at the center of a global outpouring of sympathy. The logistical coordination of this aid was a formidable task. Temporary command centers were established in unaffected towns to direct the flow of supplies and personnel into the disaster zone. The Dutch Red Cross, working alongside the military and local authorities, set up emergency shelters in schools, churches, and community halls. Medical teams treated injuries ranging from hypothermia to infections caused by contaminated water. Engineers began the urgent work of closing dike breaches, often under dangerous conditions, using caissons, sandbags, and whatever materials could be found. The priority was to prevent further flooding during the next high tide, even as the immediate needs of survivors, food, clean water, and shelter, remained pressing. The flood of 1953 left an indelible mark on the Dutch national consciousness. It was a moment when the vulnerability of the country's geography was laid bare, but also when the resilience and solidarity of its people shone through. The rapid mobilization of both national and international aid demonstrated that in the face of overwhelming disaster, cooperation could transcend borders and politics. Yet the tragedy also underscored the urgent need for a long-term solution to the perennial threat of the sea. In the months that followed, as the waters receded and the rebuilding began, the seeds were sown for a project that would transform the Dutch coastline and redefine the nation's relationship with water. The Delta Works. Chapter 7. The Delta Commission. In the immediate aftermath of the 1953 North Sea flood, the Dutch government recognized that piecemeal repairs and local initiatives would not be enough to prevent a recurrence of such devastation. Within weeks, the Ministry of Transport and Water Management moved to establish a special body tasked with developing a comprehensive plan for the long-term protection of the southwestern delta. This body, officially named the Delta Commission, was formed in February 1953 and given extraordinary authority to investigate the causes of the disaster, assess the weaknesses in the existing coastal defenses, and propose a unified strategy to safeguard the nation. The urgency of its mission was underscored by the fact that many dikes were still breached, and large areas remained underwater when the Commission began its work. Its members were drawn from the highest ranks of Dutch engineering, hydrology, and public administration, ensuring that the expertise required for such an ambitious undertaking was present from the outset. At the heart of the Commission's technical vision was Johan van Veen, the chief engineer of Rijkswaterstaat's Storm Surge Service. Van Veen had been warning for years that the southwestern provinces were dangerously exposed, and his pre-war proposals for shortening the coastline now became the foundation for the Commission's thinking. He brought with him a wealth of hydrological data, much of it collected painstakingly over decades, and a conviction that only a radical reconfiguration of the delta could provide the level of safety the Netherlands required. Van Veen's approach was both bold and pragmatic. By closing off several major sea inlets and estuaries, the total length of sea dikes could be reduced by hundreds of kilometers, concentrating resources on fewer, stronger defenses. This would not only improve safety but also create new land and freshwater lakes, offering economic and agricultural benefits. The Delta Commission's work was methodical and data-driven. It began by mapping every section of the existing dike system, noting variations in height, width, and structural integrity. Historical records of storm surges were analyzed alongside tidal and meteorological data to determine the maximum probable water levels that could be expected in the future. The Commission also studied the performance of the dikes during the 1953 flood, identifying points of failure and the underlying causes, whether poor maintenance, inadequate design, or unforeseen hydrodynamic forces. From this analysis emerged the concept of the delta height, a new standard for dike elevation based on the highest conceivable storm surge, with a safety margin to account for uncertainties. This represented a significant departure from previous practice, which had often relied on historical precedent rather than worst-case scenarios. The Commission's mandate extended beyond engineering to include economic, environmental, and social considerations. Closing off estuaries would have profound effects on fisheries, shipping routes, and tidal ecosystems. The Commission consulted with fishermen, port authorities, and environmental scientists to understand the potential consequences and to explore ways of mitigating them. It also examined the financial implications of the Delta Plan, recognizing that the scale of the works would require sustained investment over decades. The political dimension was equally complex. The plan would need the support of Parliament, provincial governments, and local water boards, as well as the public, whose taxes would ultimately fund the project. The Commission's reports were therefore written not only in technical language, but also in terms that could convey the urgency and benefits of the plan to a broader audience. By the time the Delta Commission presented its final recommendations in 1955, it had laid out one of the most ambitious civil engineering programs in history. The Delta Plan called for the closure of the Haringvliet, Grevelingen, and Eastern Scheldt estuaries, the construction of massive dams and sluices, and the reinforcement of all remaining sea dikes to the new delta height standard. It was a vision that combined technical ingenuity with a deep understanding of the Netherlands' unique relationship with water. The Commission's work transformed the national conversation about flood defense, shifting it from reactive repairs to proactive, integrated planning on a scale never before attempted. In doing so, it set the stage for the creation of the Delta Works, a project that would not only reshape the Dutch coastline, but also become a global model for living with the sea. Chapter 8: The Delta Plan Unveiled. When the Delta Commission presented its findings in 1955, the Netherlands was still in the midst of repairing the physical and emotional damage caused by the 1953 flood. Yet, the report did not dwell on the past. It looked decisively toward the future. The Delta Plan, as it came to be known, was a blueprint for nothing less than the re-engineering of the southwestern Netherlands. Its central premise was simple in concept, but monumental in execution. By closing off the tidal estuaries of the Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt, with massive dams and barriers, the coastline could be shortened by approximately 700 kilometers. This would drastically reduce the length of sea dikes that needed to be maintained, concentrating resources on fewer, stronger defenses. The plan was not merely about rebuilding what had been lost. It was about creating a new, more secure relationship between the Dutch people and the waters that surrounded them. The Delta Plan was grounded in rigorous hydrological science. The Commission's engineers calculated the maximum conceivable storm surge levels for each section of the coast, factoring in tidal ranges, wind patterns, and atmospheric pressure anomalies. From these calculations emerged the delta norm, a safety standard that required sea defenses to withstand a flood with a statistical probability of occurring only once in 10,000 years for the most densely populated areas. This was an unprecedented level of protection, far exceeding the standards in place anywhere else in the world at the time. The plan also incorporated lessons from the Zuiderzee works, particularly in the use of large-scale dams and sluices, but adapted them to the unique challenges of the delta's multiple estuaries and tidal flows. The proposed works were divided into a series of major projects, each targeting a specific waterway. The Haringvliet, Grevelingen, and Eastern Scheldt were to be closed by massive dams, while the Hollandsche IJssel, a critical access point to Rotterdam, would be protected by a movable storm surge barrier. The Western Scheldt, vital for shipping access to the port of Antwerp, would remain open but be flanked by reinforced dikes. The plan also called for the raising and strengthening of all remaining sea dikes to the new delta norm. Beyond flood protection, the closures would create new freshwater lakes, improve road connections between islands, and open possibilities for land reclamation and agricultural expansion. The Delta Plan was thus both a defensive measure and an economic development strategy, promising to reshape the physical and economic landscape of the Southwest. The unveiling of the plan sparked intense debate. Supporters hailed it as a visionary project that would secure the Netherlands for generations, while critics raised concerns about its cost, environmental impact, and potential disruption to fisheries. Closing tidal estuaries would alter ecosystems that had sustained shellfish and fish populations for centuries, threatening the livelihoods of fishing communities. There were also fears that the loss of tidal flushing could lead to water quality problems in the new lakes. The Delta Commission acknowledged these concerns but argued that the risks of inaction were far greater. The memory of 1953 was still raw, and the prospect of another such disaster lent urgency to the project's approval. Parliament ultimately endorsed the plan, recognizing that the scale of the challenge demanded a bold and unified response. With political backing secured, the Delta Plan moved from paper to reality. The works would be carried out in phases over several decades, allowing for adjustments as new technologies and environmental knowledge emerged. The first projects would focus on the most vulnerable areas, such as the Hollandsche IJssel, while longer-term closures like the Eastern Scheldt would be tackled later. The plan's unveiling marked the beginning of one of the largest civil engineering endeavors in history, a project that would test the limits of human ingenuity and endurance. It was a statement of intent from a nation that had lived for centuries in the shadow of the sea. Never again would the waters be allowed to take so much, so suddenly, from the land and the people who called it home. Chapter 9. The first project, Hollandsche IJsselkering. The Hollandsche IJsselkering, or Hollandsche IJssel storm surge barrier, was the first tangible manifestation of the Delta Plan, and its urgency was beyond dispute. The Hollandsche IJssel is a distributary of the Rhine that flows into the Nieuwe Maas near Rotterdam, one of the busiest ports in the world. In 1953, floodwaters had come perilously close to overtopping the dikes along this waterway, threatening not only the city of Rotterdam but also the densely populated and economically vital Randstad region. The Delta Commission identified this location as a critical weak point in the nation's defenses. If a storm surge were to push up the new waterweg and into the Hollandsche IJssel, the consequences could be catastrophic, flooding the heart of the Netherlands' industrial and commercial infrastructure. For this reason, the Commission recommended that the very first project under the Delta Plan should be a movable barrier capable of sealing off the river during extreme high water events. Construction began in 1954, just a year after the flood, under the direction of Rijkswaterstaat, and with the involvement of several major Dutch engineering firms. The design called for two massive steel gates, each weighing hundreds of tons, suspended between concrete towers on either side of the river. These gates would normally remain open, allowing ships to pass freely and the river to flow unimpeded. However, when a storm surge threatened, the gates could be lowered into the water to block the incoming tide. This dual requirement, maintaining navigability while providing absolute protection during emergencies, posed significant engineering challenges. The barrier had to be strong enough to withstand the immense hydraulic forces of a North Sea storm, yet precise enough in its operation to be deployed quickly and reliably. The construction site itself presented formidable logistical difficulties. The Hollandsche IJssel is a busy shipping route, and work had to be carefully coordinated to minimize disruption to river traffic. Temporary cofferdams were built to allow the foundations of the towers to be laid in dry conditions, while heavy lift cranes and floating platforms were used to position the steel gates. The project also required the installation of sophisticated control systems to monitor water levels and operate the gates remotely. Engineers and workers labored in all weather conditions, aware that each day brought them closer to the next storm season. The sense of urgency was palpable. The memory of 1953 was still fresh, and the public followed the progress of the barrier closely through newspapers and radio reports. When the Hollandsche IJsselkering was officially opened in 1958 by Queen Juliana, it was hailed as a triumph of Dutch engineering and a symbol of the nation's determination never to be caught unprepared again. The barrier's completion marked the first major milestone in the Delta Works program, demonstrating that the ambitious vision of the Delta Plan could be translated into practical, functioning infrastructure. It also provided immediate, tangible benefits. Rotterdam and its surrounding areas now had a reliable safeguard against the kind of surge that had nearly inundated them just 5 years earlier. The project's success boosted public confidence in the Delta Works and helped secure political and financial support for the larger, more complex projects that lay ahead. In the decades since its completion, the Hollandse IJsselkering has been deployed numerous times during high water events, proving its worth as a critical component of the Netherlands' flood defense system. It has also undergone periodic upgrades to ensure that it meets modern safety standards and can cope with the evolving challenges of climate change and sea level rise. As the first completed structure of the Delta Works, it set the tone for the entire program. A blend of bold vision, meticulous engineering, and an unwavering commitment to protecting the land and people of the Netherlands. Its legacy endures not only in its continued operation, but also in the confidence it inspired. A confidence that the Dutch could, through ingenuity and determination, hold back the sea. Chapter 10. Closing the Estuaries. The closure of the estuaries in the southwestern Netherlands was at the heart of the Delta Plan's strategy to shorten the coastline and strengthen the nation's defenses. Each estuary presented its own set of challenges, shaped by geography, tidal patterns, and the needs of local communities. The first to be tackled was the Zand Creek, a relatively small tidal inlet between Noord-Beveland and Zuid-Beveland in Zeeland. Work began in 1958, and the Zand Creek Dam was completed in 1960, sealing off the inlet and creating a calm freshwater lake. This project served as a proving ground for the techniques and equipment that would be used on larger closures. The success of the Zand Creek Dam demonstrated that it was possible to work in tidal waters with precision and speed, even under the unpredictable conditions of the North Sea. Following the Zand Creek, attention turned to the Veersgat, a larger and more complex estuary separating Noord-Beveland from Walcheren. The Veersgat Dam, completed in 1961, was a monumental undertaking, requiring the construction of massive sand embankments, reinforced with stone and asphalt. The closure transformed the Veersmeer into a recreational freshwater lake, boosting tourism and water sports in the region. However, it also marked the beginning of ecological changes that would become a recurring theme in the Delta Works. The loss of tidal flow altered habitats for fish and shellfish, forcing local fisheries to adapt or relocate. These early closures underscored the trade-offs inherent in the Delta Plan. While safety and economic development were paramount, environmental impacts could not be ignored. The Grevelingen, a wide and deep estuary between Gore-Overflakkee and Schouwen-Duiveland, posed a greater challenge. Its closure required the construction of the Grevelingen Dam, completed in 1971, which was one of the longest dams in the Delta Works. The project demanded vast quantities of sand, clay, and stone, much of it dredged from the seabed and transported by specialized vessels. The dam not only provided flood protection, but also created the Grevelingenmeer, which became Europe's largest saltwater lake due to the decision to maintain limited tidal exchange through sluices. This compromise preserved some of the estuary's unique marine life while still achieving the primary goal of reducing the coastline. The Grevelingen project showcased the evolving sophistication of Dutch hydraulic engineering, blending safety with environmental considerations in a way that earlier closures had not. Each estuary closure required meticulous planning to account for tidal currents, sediment transport, and the immense hydraulic forces at play. Engineers developed innovative techniques such as the use of caissons, large hollow concrete structures that could be floated into position and sunk to form part of the dam. These caissons were often built in temporary dry docks and then towed to the closure site, where they were carefully aligned and filled with sand and stone. The timing of the final closure was critical, often taking place during neap tides when water movement was at its weakest. Even so, the last gap could only be sealed in a matter of hours, requiring precise coordination of dredgers, cranes, and work crews. The successful execution of these closures was a testament to the skill and discipline of the engineers, contractors, and laborers involved. By the early 1970s, the closure of the Zand Creek, Vierse Gat, and Grevelingen had significantly reduced the length of the Dutch coastline and improved flood protection for Zeeland and South Holland. These projects also laid the groundwork for the more complex and controversial closures still to come, particularly the Eastern Scheldt. The experience gained in managing tidal flows, mitigating environmental impacts, and coordinating large-scale construction in challenging marine conditions would prove invaluable in the next phases of the Delta Works. The closing of the estuaries was not just a series of engineering feats. It was a decisive step in reshaping the geography of the Netherlands, turning a fragmented delta into a more defensible and interconnected landscape. Chapter 11: The Oosterschelde-Kering Debate. The Eastern Scheldt, or Oosterschelde, was the largest and most ecologically rich of the southwestern estuaries, and its closure was initially a central element of the Delta Plan. The original design called for a solid dam, similar to those built across the Zandkreek, Viersgat, and Grevelingen, which would permanently separate the estuary from the North Sea. This would have transformed the Oosterschelde into a freshwater lake, eliminating the tidal currents that had shaped its unique marine environment for centuries. From an engineering standpoint, the closure promised maximum safety. It would remove a long stretch of vulnerable coastline from exposure to storm surges and reduce the maintenance burden on surrounding dikes. However, as planning advanced in the late 1960s and early 1970s, opposition began to mount from an unexpected coalition of fishermen, environmentalists, and scientists who feared the irreversible consequences of sealing off the estuary. The Oosterschelde was home to one of Europe's most productive shellfish industries, particularly mussels and oysters, which depended on the constant exchange of salt water and nutrients from the North Sea. Fishermen warned that a complete closure would destroy their livelihoods, as the shift to fresh water would wipe out the delicate balance of salinity and tidal flow that sustained the shellfish beds. Environmental groups, still in their infancy in the Netherlands at the time, argued that the estuary's tidal flats, salt marshes, and channels supported a rich biodiversity of birds, fish, and marine invertebrates. Scientists added their voices, pointing out that the Oosterschelde's ecosystem was unique, not only in the Netherlands but in all of northwestern Europe, and that its loss would be a blow to both nature and culture. These concerns gained traction in the public sphere, amplified by media coverage and growing awareness of environmental issues in the 1970s. The debate over the Oosterschelde closure became one of the most contentious episodes in the history of the Delta Works. On one side stood the engineers and policymakers who emphasized the paramount importance of safety. On the other, those who argued for preserving the estuary's natural character. The government faced a dilemma. Abandoning the closure would leave a significant gap in the coastal defense system, but proceeding as planned risked destroying an irreplaceable ecosystem and a centuries-old fishing tradition. The turning point came in 1974, when the Dutch Parliament, under mounting public pressure, ordered a review of the project. This review explored alternative designs that could provide storm surge protection, while allowing tidal exchange to continue. The challenge was unprecedented. No one had ever attempted to build a barrier that could be closed during storms, but remain open the rest of the time. The solution that emerged was revolutionary, a storm surge barrier with movable gates, known as the Oosterscheldekering. Instead of a solid dam, the barrier would consist of massive concrete piers supporting steel gates that could be lowered into place during extreme high water events. When not in use, the gates would remain open, allowing the tides to flow freely and preserving much of the estuary's ecological character. This compromise satisfied neither side completely. Engineers had to accept a slightly lower level of protection than a solid dam would provide, while environmentalists acknowledged that some changes to the ecosystem were inevitable. But it represented a landmark in balancing human safety with environmental stewardship. The decision also marked a shift in Dutch water management philosophy, signaling that future projects would need to consider ecological impacts alongside engineering imperatives. Construction of the Oosterscheldekering began in 1976 and would take nearly a decade to complete, involving some of the most complex marine engineering ever attempted. The barrier's design required precision manufacturing of the piers and gates, as well as the development of new techniques for anchoring them in the shifting sands of the estuary floor. The project became a symbol of Dutch ingenuity and adaptability, demonstrating that even the most ambitious plans could evolve in response to public debate and scientific insight. When the barrier was officially opened in 1986 by Queen Beatrix, it stood not only as a triumph of engineering, but also as a testament to the Netherlands' willingness to innovate in the face of competing priorities. The Oosterscheldekering remains the largest of the Delta Works structures and a global icon of integrated coastal management, embodying the principle that safety and nature need not be mutually exclusive. Chapter 12: The Maislandkering and Nieuwe Waterweg. By the late 20th century, the Netherlands had completed most of the monumental works envisioned in the original Delta Plan, yet one critical vulnerability remained: the Nieuwe Waterweg, the deep-water shipping channel that connects the port of Rotterdam to the North Sea. This waterway is the economic lifeline of the Netherlands, handling a vast proportion of the nation's imports and exports, and it could not be closed by a permanent dam without crippling maritime trade. For decades, the risk of a storm surge traveling unhindered up the Nieuwe Waterweg and flooding Rotterdam and the surrounding Randstad region was accepted as an unavoidable trade-off for keeping the port open. However, as sea levels began to rise and storms became more intense, the need for a protective structure that could safeguard the city without impeding shipping became increasingly urgent. The challenge was formidable: to design a barrier that could remain completely out of the way during normal operations, yet be deployed rapidly and reliably in the face of an extreme storm. The solution emerged in the early 1990s in the form of the Maeslandkering, a storm surge barrier unlike any other in the world. Located near Hoek van Holland, where the Nieuwe Waterweg meets the North Sea, the barrier consists of two enormous floating gates, each as long as the Eiffel Tower is tall when laid on its side. These gates are mounted on massive ball and socket joints, allowing them to swing into position across the waterway when needed. Under normal conditions, the gates rest in dry docks recessed into the banks of the channel, invisible to passing ships. When a storm surge of 3 meters above normal sea level is predicted, the docks are flooded, the gates float out, and then sink into place on the riverbed, sealing off the channel. This design allows the Maeslandkering to combine the openness required for one of the world's busiest ports with the security of a solid flood defense during emergencies. The engineering behind the Maeslandkering pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible at the time. The ball and socket joints, each weighing 680 tons, are the largest ever constructed, designed to withstand the immense hydraulic forces of a North Sea storm. The gates themselves are hollow steel structures, carefully balanced to float when their docks are flooded, but heavy enough to settle firmly onto the riverbed when filled with water. The barrier is fully automated, controlled by a sophisticated computer system that continuously monitors sea levels, wind speeds, and tidal conditions. If the system predicts a surge exceeding the threshold, it initiates the closure sequence without human intervention, ensuring that the barrier can be deployed even if communications or transport links are disrupted. This level of automation was groundbreaking in the 1990s and remains a model for modern flood defense systems worldwide. Construction of the Maeslandkering began in 1991 and was completed in 1997 as part of the larger Europoortkering project, which also included the Hartelkering barrier and the reinforcement of surrounding dikes. The project was a joint effort between Rijkswaterstaat, Dutch engineering firms, and international contractors, reflecting the global significance of protecting Rotterdam's port. The opening ceremony in 1997 was a moment of national pride, attended by Queen Beatrix and broadcast across the country. The Maislandkering quickly became an icon of Dutch ingenuity, a visible reminder that the Netherlands remained at the forefront of hydraulic engineering. It also symbolized a new era in flood defense, one in which flexibility and adaptability were as important as sheer strength. Since its completion, the Maislandkering has been closed only a handful of times for actual storm surges, but it is tested annually in a full-scale closure exercise known as the functioning test. These tests are major events, drawing spectators and media coverage, and they serve both to ensure the barrier's readiness and to remind the public of the ever-present threat from the sea. The Maeslandkering stands as the final great structure of the Delta Works, completing the protective ring envisioned after the 1953 disaster. Yet, it is also a bridge to the future, embodying the principles of adaptive engineering that will be essential as the Netherlands confronts the challenges of the 21st century: rising seas, shifting weather patterns, and the need to balance economic vitality with environmental resilience. Chapter 13: Engineering Feats and Innovations. The Delta Works were not merely a sequence of dams, sluices, and barriers. They were a proving ground for some of the most advanced civil engineering techniques of the 20th century. The sheer scale of the works demanded innovations in design, materials, and construction methods that had never before been attempted in such challenging marine environments. One of the most significant breakthroughs was the development and deployment of massive concrete caissons, hollow, watertight structures that could be floated into position and then sunk to form part of a dam or barrier. These caissons, some weighing more than 18,000 tons, were constructed in specially built dry docks, towed to their final location, and carefully lowered onto prepared foundations on the seabed. Their use allowed engineers to close wide tidal channels in a matter of hours during carefully chosen tidal windows, minimizing the risk of catastrophic failure from strong currents. Another hallmark of the Delta Works was the integration of advanced dredging technology. The Netherlands had long been a leader in dredging, but the demands of the Delta Plan pushed the industry to new heights. Cutter suction dredgers, trailing suction hopper dredgers, and specialized stone-laying vessels were deployed to reshape seabeds, create artificial islands, and deposit millions of tons of sand and rock with pinpoint accuracy. In some cases, entire work platforms were constructed offshore to serve as staging areas for equipment and materials. The precision required was extraordinary. Foundations for piers and caissons had to be level within centimeters, even in turbulent tidal waters. This level of accuracy was achieved through a combination of skilled seamanship, innovative positioning systems, and constant monitoring of currents and sediment movement. The Oosterschelde Kering, in particular, demanded unprecedented engineering solutions. The barrier's 65 massive concrete piers, each weighing up to 18,000 tons, had to be placed on the shifting sands of the estuary floor without settling unevenly. To achieve this, engineers developed a novel mat foundation system. Enormous mats woven from synthetic fabric and filled with sand and gravel were laid on the seabed to create a stable base. These mats, some the size of football fields, were rolled out from specialized ships in a delicate operation that required calm seas and precise coordination. Once the mats were in place, the piers could be floated over them and lowered into position with the aid of tidal currents, a process that combined brute force with an almost surgical level of control. Material science also played a crucial role in the success of the Delta works. The concrete used for caissons, piers, and sluices had to withstand constant exposure to salt water, freeze-thaw cycles, and the immense pressures of storm surges. Engineers experimented with new mixes, incorporating additives to improve durability and reduce permeability. Steel components such as the gates of the Mace Landkering and the sluice mechanisms in the Haringvliet Dam were treated with advanced anti-corrosion coatings and designed for ease of maintenance. The scale of fabrication was immense. Shipyards and factories across the Netherlands were enlisted to produce the specialized parts, creating a nationwide industrial effort reminiscent of wartime mobilization. Perhaps the most remarkable innovation of all was the way in which the Delta Works integrated engineering with environmental and social considerations. As the program progressed, lessons learned from earlier closures informed later projects, leading to designs that preserved tidal flows, maintained water quality, and supported local economies. The willingness to adapt, to change a solid dam into a movable barrier, to incorporate sluices for ecological reasons, to invest in more complex solutions when simpler ones might have sufficed, was itself an engineering achievement. It reflected a broader understanding that the success of the Delta Works would be measured not only in kilometers of coastline defended, but in the resilience of the communities and ecosystems they protected. In this way, the Delta Works became more than a feat of construction. They were a living demonstration of how human ingenuity could work with, rather than simply against, the forces of nature. Chapter 14: Transforming Zeeland and South Holland. The completion of the early phases of the Delta Works brought about a transformation in Zeeland and South Holland that extended far beyond flood protection. For centuries, many of the islands in Zeeland, such as Schouwen-Duiveland, Noord-Beveland, and Tholen, had been isolated from one another, connected only by ferries that were often delayed or cancelled due to bad weather. The construction of the massive dams and causeways that closed the estuaries also created permanent road links between these islands, knitting them together into a more cohesive region. The Gravelingen Dam, Brouwers Dam, and Zeelandbrug became vital arteries, enabling the free movement of people, goods, and services. This newfound connectivity reduced travel times dramatically, encouraged commerce, and allowed for the centralization of services such as healthcare and education, which had previously been difficult to access for residents of the more remote communities. Economic revitalization followed swiftly in the wake of these infrastructural changes. The improved transport links opened Zeeland to greater tourism, with visitors drawn to its beaches, lakes, and the engineering marvels of the Delta Works themselves. Former tidal inlets, now transformed into calm freshwater or saltwater lakes, became hubs for sailing, windsurfing, and fishing. Towns that had once been primarily dependent on agriculture or fishing diversified their economies, with new businesses catering to visitors and seasonal residents. In South Holland, the improved flood defenses reassured investors and industries, particularly in vulnerable low-lying areas near Rotterdam and Dordrecht, that their assets were secure. This confidence spurred industrial expansion and the modernization of port facilities, further cementing the region's role as an economic powerhouse. The social impact of the Delta Works was equally profound. The trauma of the 1953 flood had left deep scars in the affected communities, many of which had lost entire families and neighborhoods. The completion of the new defenses brought a sense of security that allowed people to rebuild their lives without the constant fear of another catastrophic inundation. In Zealand, the psychological shift was palpable. Where once the sea had been viewed primarily as a threat, it was now increasingly seen as an asset to be enjoyed and harnessed. Schools incorporated lessons about the Delta Works into their curricula, fostering a sense of pride in the region's resilience and engineering achievements. Annual commemorations of the 1953 disaster continued, but they were now framed within a narrative of recovery and progress. Agriculture, long the backbone of Zeeland's economy, also benefited from the changes. The new dams and barriers reduced the risk of saltwater intrusion into farmland, protecting crops and improving yields. Farmers could invest in more intensive cultivation and modern equipment without the fear that a single storm could wipe out their livelihoods. In some areas, reclaimed land was brought into production, expanding the agricultural base. However, these gains were not without trade-offs. The loss of tidal flows in certain estuaries altered sediment patterns and water quality, affecting traditional fishing grounds and requiring adaptation by those who depended on them. Some fishing communities faced difficult transitions, shifting from open sea fishing to aquaculture or tourism-related activities. By the late 20th century, Zeeland and South Holland had been reshaped physically, economically, and socially by the Delta Works. The once fragmented islands of Zeeland were now linked by a network of roads and bridges, their economies diversified and their populations more mobile. South Holland's industrial heartland was better protected than ever before, enabling it to thrive in an increasingly globalized economy. Yet, the transformation was not solely about infrastructure or economics. It was about identity. The people of these provinces had endured one of the worst disasters in Dutch history and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose, their lives intertwined with the monumental structures that now stood between them and the sea. The Delta Works had not only defended the land, they had redefined it, creating a legacy that would shape the region for generations to come. Chapter 15: Ecological Consequences. The Delta Works, while conceived primarily as a monumental flood defense system, inevitably altered the delicate balance of the delta's ecosystems. Before the closures, the estuaries of Zeeland and South Holland were dynamic environments where salt water from the North Sea mixed with fresh water from the rivers, creating brackish habitats rich in biodiversity. Twice daily, the tides flushed these waters, bringing nutrients that sustained shellfish beds, fish nurseries, and extensive mud flats and salt marshes. The construction of solid dams across the Zand Creek, Viersegat, and Grevelingen fundamentally changed these systems. Tidal movements ceased, salinity levels shifted, and sedimentation patterns were disrupted. Areas that had once been intertidal zones became permanently submerged or permanently dry, leading to the loss of habitats for wading birds, crustaceans, and other species adapted to the ebb and flow of the tide. The most immediate and visible impact was on the fishing industry, particularly the mussel and oyster sectors that had thrived in the tidal waters of the delta. In the Veersmeer and Grevelingenmeer, the transition from tidal salt water to more stable saline or freshwater conditions rendered traditional shellfish cultivation impossible. Fishermen who had worked these waters for generations were forced to relocate their operations to the Eastern Scheldt or the North Sea, often at considerable financial and personal cost. The loss of tidal flushing also led to concerns about water quality. Without the regular exchange of seawater, nutrients and organic matter could accumulate, leading to algal blooms and oxygen depletion in summer months. These changes required new management strategies, including controlled sluicing and artificial aeration, to maintain ecological health in the closed basins. The Eastern Scheldt, spared from complete closure by the decision to build the Oosterschelde Kering, retained much of its tidal character, but even here the ecological balance shifted. The barrier's gates, while open most of the time, reduced the tidal range by about 25%, altering the extent and duration of exposure of mudflats and salt marshes. This had cascading effects on bird populations, particularly migratory species that relied on these feeding grounds during their long journeys along the East Atlantic Flyway. Some species adapted by shifting to other areas, while others saw declines in local numbers. The reduced tidal energy also affected sediment transport, leading to gradual erosion of intertidal zones, a process known as sand hunger, which continues to challenge conservation efforts today. Environmental scientists, many of whom had initially been sidelined in the urgency to build flood defenses, became increasingly involved in monitoring and mitigating these impacts. Long-term ecological studies were established to track changes in water quality, species composition, and habitat extent. These studies informed adaptive management measures, such as modifying sluice operations to mimic natural tidal rhythms where possible, or creating artificial habitats to replace those lost. The experience of the Delta Works played a role in shaping Dutch environmental policy more broadly, embedding the principle that large-scale infrastructure projects must account for ecological as well as engineering considerations. This shift in thinking would influence later initiatives, such as the Room for the River program, which sought to integrate flood management with landscape restoration. In the decades since the completion of the Delta Works, the ecological consequences have remained a subject of study, debate, and adaptation. While some losses, such as the disappearance of certain tidal habitats, are irreversible, Other changes have created new opportunities. The calm waters of the Veersay Mere and Grevelingen Mere have become important for recreation and tourism, supporting sailing, diving, and birdwatching. The Eastern Scheldt, with its unique combination of safety and tidal vitality, has become a showcase for sustainable shellfish farming and marine conservation. The story of the Delta Works' ecological impact is thus one of transformation rather than simple decline, illustrating the complex interplay between human safety, economic needs, and the resilience of natural systems in a landscape where land and water have always been inextricably linked. Chapter 16: Cultural Memory and Heritage. The 1953 North Sea flood and the monumental delta works that followed have become deeply embedded in the cultural memory of the Netherlands, particularly in Zeeland, South Holland, and North Brabant. For those who lived through the disaster, the memories are vivid and often painful. The sound of the wind howling through the night, the sudden rush of icy water, the desperate scramble to higher ground, and the haunting silence that followed when the storm subsided. These personal recollections have been passed down through families, shaping the identity of entire communities. In Zealand, the flood is not merely a historical event, it is a defining moment that continues to influence how people view the sea, their land, and their own resilience. The Delta works, in turn, are seen not only as engineering triumphs, but as monuments to survival, perseverance, and collective action. The preservation of this memory has taken many forms. The Watersnood Museum in Auverkerk, located in the very caissons used to close the final breach in the dikes after the 1953 flood, serves as both a memorial and an educational center. Opened in 2001, the museum tells the story of the disaster through photographs, personal testimonies, artifacts, and interactive exhibits. It also places the flood in a broader context, linking it to global issues of climate change and flood risk. Visitors are reminded that the lessons of 1953 remain relevant and that the struggle against the sea is ongoing. The museum has become a place of pilgrimage for survivors and their descendants, as well as for engineers, policymakers, and tourists from around the world who come to learn from the Dutch experience. Commemorations are held annually on February 1st, the anniversary of the flood. These ceremonies, often attended by government officials, survivors, and local residents, include moments of silence, the laying of wreaths, and the reading of names of those who perished. In some towns, church bells toll at the exact hour when the dikes gave way in 1953. These rituals serve not only to honor the dead, but also to reinforce the collective memory of the event, ensuring that younger generations understand the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before them. Schools in the affected regions incorporate the history of the flood and the Delta works into their curricula, often inviting survivors to speak to students. This intergenerational transmission of memory helps maintain a living connection to the past. The Delta works themselves have become part of the Netherlands' cultural heritage, recognized both nationally and internationally. In 1994, the American Society of Civil Engineers named the Delta Works one of the seven wonders of the modern world, placing it alongside landmarks such as the Panama Canal and the Channel Tunnel. This recognition reinforced the pride that many Dutch people feel in their country's ability to confront and overcome the challenges posed by its geography. The structures are celebrated not only for their technical sophistication, but also for their symbolic value. They stand as physical embodiments of the Dutch ethos of living with water rather than simply fighting against it. Guided tours, visitor centers, and interpretive signage at key sites invite the public to engage with this heritage firsthand. Art, literature, and media have also played a role in shaping the cultural memory of the flood and the Delta works. Novels, poems, and films have depicted the human drama of 1953, often focusing on themes of loss, resilience, and community solidarity. Photographers have documented both the devastation of the flood and the grandeur of the completed works, creating visual records that bridge the gap between past and present. Public art installations in Zeeland and South Holland commemorate the disaster, from sculptures of figures bracing against the wind to abstract forms evoking waves and water. Through these varied expressions, the memory of the flood and the achievement of the Delta works continue to resonate, reminding the Dutch people and the world of the enduring relationship between human society and the forces of nature. Chapter 17: Recognition and Global Influence. By the time the final major structures of the Delta Works were completed in the late 20th century, the project had already begun to attract international attention as one of the most ambitious civil engineering achievements in history. The scale, complexity, and ingenuity of the works were unprecedented, and they stood as a testament to the Netherlands' centuries-old expertise in water management. In 1994, the American Society of Civil Engineers formally recognized the Delta Works as one of the seven wonders of the modern world, placing it alongside such feats as the Panama Canal and the Channel Tunnel. This accolade was more than symbolic. It cemented the Delta Works' status as a global benchmark for flood defense and coastal engineering. The recognition also underscored the fact that the Netherlands had not only secured its own safety, but had created a model that could inspire and inform other nations facing similar threats from the sea. The global interest in the Delta Works was not limited to awards and accolades. Engineers, policymakers, and scientists from around the world began visiting the Netherlands to study the design, construction, and operation of the barriers, dams, and sluices. Delegations came from countries as diverse as the United States, Japan, Bangladesh, and the United Arab Emirates, each seeking to adapt Dutch expertise to their own unique challenges. In some cases, this led to direct collaboration. Dutch engineering firms and consultancies were contracted to advise on projects such as the Thames Barrier in London, the Meuse floodgates in Venice, and coastal protection schemes in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. The Netherlands' reputation as the world's foremost authority on living with water was firmly established, and Dutch solutions became a recognized term in the lexicon of global water management. This influence extended beyond technical consultation to the realm of policy and planning. The integrated approach of the Delta Works, combining flood defense with economic development, environmental considerations, and long-term adaptability, was increasingly seen as a model for climate resilience. International conferences on water management frequently featured Dutch experts as keynote speakers, and the country played a leading role in global initiatives such as the Delta Alliance, a network of delta regions working together to address the impacts of climate change. The Netherlands' ability to translate its own hard-earned lessons into frameworks that could be applied elsewhere gave it a unique form of soft power, one rooted not in military or economic dominance, but in the sharing of knowledge and expertise. The Delta Works also became a source of national pride and cultural diplomacy. Visitor centers at key sites such as the Oosterscheldekering and the Maaslankering were designed not only to educate the Dutch public, but also to showcase the country's achievements to international guests. These centers offered detailed exhibits on the history of the 1953 flood, the engineering challenges of the Delta Works, and the ongoing efforts to adapt to rising seas. High-profile visits by foreign dignitaries often included tours of these sites, where the story of Dutch resilience was told against the backdrop of the massive structures themselves. In this way, the Delta Works served as both a practical defense system and a symbol of the Netherlands' identity as a nation forged in its relationship with water. By the early 21st century, the Delta Works had transcended their original purpose as a national flood defense program to become a global reference point in the fight against climate change and sea level rise. The recognition they received was not merely for their engineering brilliance, but for the vision they embodied, that it is possible to confront existential environmental threats with creativity, cooperation, and determination. As other nations grappled with increasingly frequent and severe flooding, the Dutch example offered both inspiration and a practical roadmap. The Delta Works had begun as a response to a national tragedy, but their legacy was now international, influencing the way the world thought about water, safety, and the future of coastal living. Chapter 18: Maintenance and Modernization. The completion of the Delta Works in the late 20th century did not mark the end of the Netherlands' struggle against the sea, but rather the beginning of a new phase, the ongoing maintenance and modernization of the structures that had been built to protect the nation. From the outset, engineers and policymakers understood that the dams, sluices, and barriers would require constant inspection, repair, and upgrading to remain effective. Saltwater corrosion, the relentless force of tides and currents, and the gradual settlement of foundations all posed long-term risks to the integrity of the works. Reichswaterstaat, the national agency responsible for water management, established rigorous maintenance schedules, with each component of the Delta Works subject to regular inspections, both above and below the waterline. Divers, remotely operated vehicles, and sonar mapping systems became essential tools in detecting wear, cracks, or displacement in submerged structures. The modernization process was driven not only by the natural aging of the infrastructure, but also by advances in technology and changes in environmental conditions. The original Delta norm, which set the safety standard for flood defenses, was based on statistical models from the 1950s and 1960s. By the 1990s and early 2000s, improved meteorological data, satellite observations, and climate modeling revealed that sea levels were rising faster than previously anticipated, and that extreme weather events were becoming more frequent. This prompted a reassessment of the design parameters for the Delta works. In some cases, dikes were raised and widened to meet updated safety standards. In others, mechanical systems such as sluice gates and barrier controls were replaced with more reliable computer-driven technology. The Mice Landkering, for example, underwent significant software upgrades to improve its predictive capabilities and ensure faster, more precise deployment in the event of a storm surge. One of the most significant modernization efforts involved the integration of real-time monitoring systems across the Delta works. Sensors embedded in the structures now continuously measure water pressure, salinity, temperature, and structural strain, transmitting data to centralized control centers. This allows for predictive maintenance where potential problems can be addressed before they lead to failure. The use of geographic information systems, GIS, and digital twins, virtual models of the physical structures, has further enhanced the ability to simulate stress scenarios and plan interventions. These technologies have transformed the way the Delta works are managed, shifting from a reactive approach to a proactive, data-driven strategy that maximizes both safety and efficiency. Modernization has also meant adapting the Delta works to meet new environmental and societal priorities. In the decades since their construction, there has been a growing recognition of the need to balance flood protection with ecological health. This has led to modifications such as the installation of fish passages in sluices, the adjustment of sluice operations to mimic natural tidal rhythms, and the creation of new wetlands to offset habitat loss. In some cases, modernization has involved rethinking the original design philosophy altogether. The Haringvliet sluices, for example, were partially opened in 2018 under the Kiebersloot policy, allowing limited saltwater intrusion to restore estuarine conditions and improve fish migration routes. Such measures reflect a broader shift in Dutch water management toward a more adaptive, nature-inclusive approach. The ongoing maintenance and modernization of the Delta works are a reminder that flood defense is not a one-time achievement, but a perpetual commitment. The structures that protect the Netherlands today are the product of decades of vigilance, investment, and innovation, and they will continue to evolve in response to new challenges. As climate change accelerates and sea levels rise, the lessons learned from maintaining and upgrading the Delta works will be invaluable, not only for the Netherlands but for coastal regions around the world. The Delta works were born from tragedy, but their continued renewal ensures that they remain a living, dynamic system, capable of safeguarding the land and people they were built to protect for generations to come. Chapter 19: Climate Change and Sea Level Rise. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Netherlands faced a new and formidable challenge: the accelerating impacts of climate change. While the Delta Works had been designed to withstand the most extreme storm surges imaginable in the mid-20th century, scientific evidence was mounting that the parameters on which those designs were based were shifting. Global sea levels, which had risen only modestly in the decades after 1953, were now increasing at an accelerating rate due to the thermal expansion of seawater and the melting of glaciers and polar ice sheets. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, projected that by the end of the century, sea levels could rise by as much as 1 meter or more under high-emission scenarios. For a country where two-thirds of the population lives in areas vulnerable to flooding, this was not an abstract concern, but an existential threat. The implications for the Delta Works were profound. The original Delta norm, which set the safety standard for flood defenses, was based on the statistical probability of extreme events occurring under historical climate conditions. With rising seas, the baseline water level from which storm surges began would be higher, meaning that surges of a given height would occur more frequently. A storm surge that might have been expected once in 10,000 years could, under new conditions, occur several times within a century. This erosion of the safety margin demanded a reassessment of the entire coastal defense system, Rijkswaterstaat and the Delta Program. Commissioner-initiated comprehensive studies to model future scenarios, incorporating not only sea level rise but also changes in river discharge patterns, precipitation extremes, and land subsidence, a particular concern in the peat-rich lowlands of the western Netherlands. Adapting to these new realities required a shift in philosophy from static defense to dynamic resilience. The Delta Works, while monumental, were not immutable. They could be upgraded, modified, and supplemented with new measures. In some cases, this meant reinforcing existing structures, raising dikes, strengthening revetments, and upgrading mechanical systems in barriers and sluices. In others, it meant rethinking the relationship between land and water altogether. The Room for the River program, launched in the early 2000s, exemplified this new approach by deliberately creating space for rivers to overflow safely during high water events, reducing pressure on dikes and lowering flood risk in urban areas. This philosophy extended to the coast, where sand nourishment projects, such as the innovative sand motor near The Hague, use natural processes to build up beaches and dunes as a buffer against the sea. International collaboration became an increasingly important part of the Netherlands' climate adaptation strategy. Dutch engineers and policymakers engaged with counterparts in other vulnerable delta regions, from Bangladesh to New Orleans, sharing expertise and learning from diverse experiences. The Netherlands also played a leading role in global climate negotiations, advocating for ambitious mitigation targets, while emphasizing the need for robust adaptation measures. The Delta Works, once a purely national project, became a symbol of what could be achieved when long-term vision, political will, and technical ingenuity were combined. Yet Dutch leaders were careful to stress that even the most advanced engineering could not provide absolute security in the face of unchecked climate change. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions remained essential to keeping future sea level rise within manageable limits. By the 2020s, the conversation about the Delta Works had evolved from one of completion to one of perpetual evolution. The structures that had been built in response to the disaster of 1953 were now part of a living system, continuously monitored, maintained, and adapted to meet emerging threats. Climate change had transformed the challenge from defending against a known enemy, the North Sea as it had been, to preparing for an uncertain and potentially more dangerous future. In this context, the Delta Work stood not as a final answer, but as a foundation, a platform on which new layers of protection, innovation, and ecological integration would be built. The Dutch experience underscored a truth that resonated far beyond its borders. In a changing climate, resilience is not a fixed state, but an ongoing process, one that demands vigilance, adaptability, and the courage to act before disaster strikes. Chapter 20: The Future of Living with Water. As the Netherlands moves deeper into the 21st century, the legacy of the Delta Works is no longer viewed solely as a completed engineering triumph, but as a living, evolving system that must adapt to an era of unprecedented environmental change. The country's relationship with water has always been defined by a delicate balance between defense and coexistence. But climate change, sea level rise, and shifting weather patterns have made that balance more precarious. The Dutch approach has increasingly shifted from a purely defensive posture, building ever higher and stronger barriers, to one that embraces flexibility, adaptability, and integration with natural processes. This philosophy is encapsulated in the concept of living with water, which acknowledges that absolute control is neither possible nor desirable, and that resilience comes from working with the dynamics of the environment rather than attempting to dominate them entirely. Central to this future-oriented vision is the Delta program, a long-term national strategy that builds upon the foundations of the Delta Works while anticipating the challenges of the next century. Updated annually, the program sets out adaptive pathways for flood risk management, freshwater supply, and spatial planning, with a time horizon extending to 2100 and beyond. It incorporates the latest climate projections, demographic trends, and economic forecasts, ensuring that decisions made today remain viable under a range of possible futures. This adaptive approach means that infrastructure can be upgraded or reconfigured as conditions change, avoiding the pitfalls of overbuilding for a single, static scenario. The Delta program also emphasizes the integration of flood protection with urban development, agriculture, and nature conservation, reflecting a holistic understanding of the interconnectedness of land, water, and society. Innovative projects are already reshaping the Dutch landscape in line with this philosophy. Along the coast, large-scale sand nourishment schemes, such as the sand motor near Ter Heide, use natural currents to distribute sediment and build up dunes over time, providing a dynamic buffer against the sea. In riverine areas, the Room for the River program has created floodplains, bypassed channels, and lowered groins to give rivers more space during high flows, reducing pressure on dikes while enhancing biodiversity and recreational opportunities. Urban areas are experimenting with water squares, floating neighborhoods, and green roofs to manage heavy rainfall and reduce heat stress. These initiatives demonstrate that flood resilience can be achieved in ways that also improve quality of life, strengthen ecosystems, and stimulate economic activity. Internationally, the Netherlands continues to share its expertise, but it is also learning from others. Collaborations with delta regions in Asia, Africa, and the Americas have highlighted the importance of cultural, social, and economic contexts in shaping water management strategies. While the technical principles of the Delta Works remain relevant, the Dutch recognize that the future will require more than engineering alone. Governance, community engagement, and equitable decision-making are increasingly seen as essential components of resilience. This is particularly important as climate impacts disproportionately affect vulnerable populations, both within the Netherlands and globally. The Dutch experience, born of centuries of necessity, offers valuable lessons, but it also underscores the need for humility and openness to new ideas. Looking ahead, the future of living with water in the Netherlands will be defined by a continuous process of adaptation. The Delta Works will remain a central pillar of protection, but they will be complemented by a mosaic of measures that blend hard infrastructure with soft, nature-based solutions. The challenge will be to maintain the political will, financial investment, and societal consensus that have made the Dutch approach so successful, even as the threats evolve and intensify. In this sense, the story of the Delta Works is not ending. It is entering a new chapter, one in which the boundaries between engineering, ecology, and community are increasingly blurred. The ultimate goal remains unchanged from the days after the 1953 flood, to safeguard the land and the people who live upon it. But the means of achieving that goal will continue to evolve, ensuring that the Netherlands remains not only a nation protected by water, but a nation defined by its enduring and dynamic relationship with it.